The scandal is in plain sight. The amount of money that Elon Musk spent to get Trump elected, that should be a major scandal in and of itself.
People are numb to the fact that there is what feels like a money and politics scandal every day, because it's essentially Watergate every hour.
They haven't broken any laws, have they? When people talk about it as a scandal, it's difficult to work out precisely what the scandal is. The backlash clearly really shocked Musk.
He seems to have found the outer limits of public tolerance for brazen oligarchic control of government.
Hello, this is Krishnan with The Forecast, and we're going to spend this episode talking about big money, billionaires, the oligarchs in Trump's America and what they're getting in return for their money. We're also going to talk about crypto and how the Trump family and other families in the Trump administration are involved in this growing industry and how they're getting breathtaking amounts of money from the Middle East. And we're also going to look at two of the big news stories of the day. Of course, the last day of Elon Musk in the US administration. He's leaving DOGE and going back to his own businesses. Some people think it's all been a disaster for him, but what's he got out of the whole experience? And with some great guests, we're also going to be talking about the court ruling that says Trump's Liberation Day tariffs are illegal, and he's gone beyond his authority. That's thrown the whole global economic system into confusion and disarray because nobody really knows what that means for negotiations with America over trade. Joining me are two brilliant journalists and authors from the United States. Evan Osnos is from The New Yorker and the author of a new book coming out in the next few days called The Haves and the Have-Yots, about the ultra-rich in America. And Ken Vogel is from the New York Times and is the author of several books, including Devil's Advocates. He's an expert in big money and billionaires in this new generation of oligarchs in America and their power in politics and what they are getting out of it as well. So thank you both very much indeed. Evan, let's start with Musk. It is tempting to think that it's all been terrible for him. What's actually happened?
Well, he got, I would say, as a return on investment, a mixed picture. In the short term, he did run into this extraordinary public backlash. He seems to have found the outer limits of public tolerance for brazen oligarchic control of government. You know, in 250 years of American history, we have never had somebody who could spend more than anybody else and then quite literally get an office in the White House complex. He was sleeping at times in the Lincoln bedroom and was given control over a vast swath of the government that allowed him, in effect, to fire tens of thousands of people, including at agencies that did business with himself. And eventually you saw Tesla sales drop 71%. Profit was down massively. He also took a big hit to his personal favorability. And he read the signs and said, okay, it's time to go. However, he has laid in some extraordinarily potentially profitable opportunities, including having the Department of Defense consider SpaceX for its Golden Dome project and other things. The Department of Commerce is looking at using his other companies like Starlink for enormous government contracts. So this has been, I would say, in the short term, it's cost him culturally and in terms of his public profile, because the public is really getting sick of this kind of abuse of money in government. But it will probably be profitable for him over the long term.
Well, I mean, you say the public's getting sick. I mean, the thing that I found absolutely astonishing is how much has been allowed to go on. I mean, this is an administration which not only is welcoming in billionaires, but is making huge amounts of money and enriching itself and is not shy about it or ashamed of it or trying to really hide anything. So when you see, what Musk has ended up getting out of it in business terms, is he, there's a sort of an element in which he's the sort of the trailblazer, the role model for how billionaires can use the US government to their advantage.
Yeah, he is in some ways the apex figure of this period of a politics of plunder. Let's call it what it is. I mean, this is a time in which there is so much money swirling around the White House that it is swamping whatever bulwarks against corruption were left in law or in culture. And yeah, I think in some ways, Krishnan, this phenomenon has been building over time, but it has ballooned in the last few years. Just to put it in perspective, 20 years ago, in 2004, American billionaires spent on the order of about $13 million in the presidential election. Fast forward to 2024, they spent 200 times as much money as that. That's just an astonishing growth. And that's partly because of decisions by the courts to free up the ability to spend money in elections. But the public, the mood, the culture, the laws, the institution, the checks and balances have been slow to adapt and to evolve. But I think that if there's one thing to keep in mind, it's that you've begun to see some of these protests this spring that have been much larger than expectations. You're seeing people like Bernie Sanders get these very large rallies of not just diehard supporters, but people who are disillusioned by Trump. And it is a sign that the Trump era of, in a sense, throwing the gates open to money in government has not just galvanized him and his friends, but it has also galvanized their opposition.
Ken, has this just moved so quickly that the American public are really struggling to catch up with what's actually happening?
Maybe. I mean, you look at polls and they consistently show that people, when the questions are put to them, will say that they oppose the influence of the outsized influence of major donors and the ultra wealthy in American politics. But it just tends not to be a voting issue, and it really hasn't been. And and so we look at times when there has been the public will that has generated the political will to create reforms that restrict the flow of big money into politics. And it usually follows a major scandal. Something like Watergate precipitated the reforms that created the Federal Election Commission and some of the campaign contribution limits that we have. There was the Enron WorldCom scandals that created like corporate restrictions on money in politics, and the early aughts or mid aughts, there was the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal that created some restrictions. But I think people are just getting inured to it. Like the scandal, it's there, the scandal is in plain sight, and the amount of money that Elon Musk spent to get Trump elected, that should be a major scandal in and of itself. But it doesn't seem to be moving the needle in the same way. And part of that, I should say, is because it takes members of Congress to actually create substantive legislative reforms that would restrict the flow of money into politics. And like all these members of Congress, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they got elected under this system. So it's to create the incentive for them to change a system that worked quite well for them really requires a great deal of public backlash. And while we do see some signs of it, I've alluded to the protest of the Tesla, the Tesla dealerships and the real hits that Tesla is taking in the stock market and the consumer market. I don't know if it's enough, frankly.
I mean, the backlash clearly really shocked Musk himself, because he felt he was doing nothing wrong. He'd done something public-spirited, in his terms, to come and try and save the American economy from vast overspending. And the Trump administration also say there's absolutely nothing wrong with what we've done in terms of bringing people like him into government. I mean, they haven't broken any laws, have they? So when people talk about it as a scandal, it's difficult to work out precisely what the scandal is.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say one thing on Musk that sort of I think captures this dynamic that I'm talking about. And I'm not trying to both sides the issue here, but the law, the Federal Election Commission advisory opinion that allowed this new wrinkle in terms of spending vast sums of money through outside groups that are technically not supposed to coordinate with campaigns. That was the sort of loophole that Elon Musk used to prop up this giant canvassing operation that Donald Trump really lacked. Like, his campaign did not have a lot of money. It probably wouldn't have been able to do the type of canvassing that Elon Musk funded. Now, whether that was determinative, I don't know. But the actual advisory opinion that allowed that was actually requested by a Democratic lawyer, a very well-connected Democratic lawyer, by a guy by the name of Mark Elias, who was doing it on behalf of a George Soros super PAC that wanted to use this new flexibility in Texas to help elect a member of Congress who was running against Ted Cruz, who lost, is a guy by the name of Colin Allred. So it just shows that, like, the laws of unintended consequences, but also the way that like both sides really do engage in this type of spending. I mean, the interesting thing with Musk and the exposure that he got and the risk that he took that is redounding to his detriment financially right now, at least in the short term, is that like the goal of his project, the conceit of like shrinking the size of government, is actually a very traditional Republican idea, but it's not one that Trump has embraced. So it's like he took all this risk, and Trump took risk as well, letting this become like a major initiative of the second administration. And it's like, who was clamoring for that? It wasn't his base. His base doesn't care about that stuff. Maybe it was the traditional Republicans, but Trump always sort of thumbed his noses at the traditional Republicans. So like, it seems to me like a major unforced error for both Musk and Trump. And now they're sort of wound up together, and maybe they're trying to extricate themselves, but it's going to be tricky for Musk to sort of reclaim his stature as someone who is really at the forefront of like the green economy and a niche of the industry that relies on liberals to be to be profitable. And now he's public enemy number one for a lot of the people who'd be the natural buyers of his products.
Yeah, I mean, public enemy number one, perhaps because he's the most famous. But there are loads of these very, very rich people sort of hanging around the administration, investing in it and getting close to it. I mean, Evan, give us a sense of how big money is linked now into the administration and what they're getting.
Well, you saw, and the whole world saw in very vivid fashion on Inauguration Day, that the stage was filled with billionaires. I mean, the world's three richest people, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg, were standing right next to the president. We've never seen anything like that. In fact, it was telling that members of the cabinet were pushed into the background, and in fact, leaders of Congress were relegated to the audience. This is an administration in which the president named 13 billionaires initially to his cabinet and his top positions. This is, in a way, the kind of fluorescence of a phenomenon that has been building for a very long time. I think it's easy for Americans to lose sight of just how big the change is. I think, as Ken put it so well, people are numb to the fact that there is what feels like a money in politics scandal every day, because it's essentially Watergate every hour. But the long-term effect, it's a little bit more like climate change. You can forget about it for the moment, but then all of a sudden it becomes a fact of your life when some big scandal erupts. The dominant fact of our time is that in 1990, there were 66 billionaires in this country. There are now more than 800. And in the period of time since Donald Trump was first elected in 2016 to now, the net worth of those billionaires has more than doubled. We are living through a period where the line is essentially going vertical, and people are feeling it in their lives. If you're one of the 400 richest Americans today, your effective tax rate is about half of what it was 50 years ago. But if you're in the middle class, it's actually gone up a little bit. That is something people feel. And as Ken described rightly, I think, in our political behavior, we don't often attach our primary frustrations to that fact. We'll say, I'm angry about bread prices, or I'm angry about eggs or something. Or oftentimes they'll be directed to focus on immigration instead. But the underlying fact is a profound disparity of political and economic power and wealth. And that is what's driving this phenomenon.
And Ken, I mean, you've been tracking what, well, perhaps not billionaires, but certainly the wealthy seem to be getting in return from Donald Trump, because he looks after his people, doesn't he? And you've been showing how he's been using the pardoning powers of the presidency to reward that.
Yeah, this is a big change. I mean, the one thing I'll say on like the wealthy sort of using the political process to get their way, like that's not new. And in fact, the wealthy, the ones who are sort of most adept at navigating the process are not the ones like Elon Musk who stick their head up and become a public figure in their own right. They're the ones who quietly give, a few million to 10 million to $100 million range to super PACs every year, and just kind of keep their head down and derive benefits from, policies, and particularly when there are Republican administrations that are, small government, low taxation. And so the biggest benefit for the wealthy overall is going to be the Trump tax cuts if the Senate is able to pushed through this bill that the House passed, that will be hugely beneficial to wealth. And there are specific special pleaders who we see getting specific things. And I think the Trump administration has been, both Trump administrations, but even more so in this one, has been like incredibly receptive to it. And the pardon power is one that these clemency grants that are given to major donors or relatives of major donors or allies of the president, wealthy people, but not all wealthy people, just people who are willing to say, I'm a Trump supporter. And even more than that, I was prosecuted because I'm a Trump supporter. And that's something that really resonates with Trump's own feeling that he was unfairly prosecuted and singled out by the Biden Justice Department, and speaks to his concerns, his claims about the weaponization of the justice system, and the way that people are able to sort of manipulate him by just saying the words. It's kind of akin to like the way Putin was able to manipulate him early on. Maybe that's changing a little bit, but like, I'm your friend and therefore you're my friend sort of thing.
We're used to the idea here that Trump pardoned the January 6th rioters because that was ideological. But these are cases that you've been writing about that are straightforward, bang to rights, people pleading guilty sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was going to say like that is the like a really acute thing that I think people can understand, because it's this unilateral, unfettered power of the president to affect some change. He doesn't need Congress to pass a bill to get a pardon. He doesn't need a treaty. It's not even like tariffs. It's just like a single stroke of the pen or several choppy strokes of his big Sharpie, are able to like effectuate something that has a real impact in a very discreet way on individuals. And he's using that to, score political points, to reward his allies, and even to punish his foes. I mean, I think it speaks to his mindset that I control the presidency, I control the levers of power, and I'm going to use them as I see fit. And whether that's to, start a crypto company and welcome people, welcome the top buyers of his cryptocurrency to a dinner with him, or whether that's giving a pardon to a friend or a family member, this is how he thinks about like what he likes about the presidency, frankly.
And is this normal? I mean, that presidents continue to pardon people through the course of their presidency. I mean, I'd always sort of assumed this was something that happens, towards the end of a presidency, when they're about to go and they're doing, they're looking for, to do some good, if you like, and to exercise some mercy. Is it normal for a president to just keep doing it all the way through an administration?
Not the way he's doing it. I mean, he's really like redefined the approach to clemency. There's a system that was set up inside the Justice Department to try to bring some order to this. And the Justice Department had criteria that said that in order to be considered for a pardon through this system, you had to have served your time. You had to pay back the restitution. You had to show remorse. And Trump has completely set all those criteria aside and completely brought the clemency operation inside the White House, where it's handled by just a few folks who are very close loyalists to him. And he's pardoning people like you alluded to, who before they serve their time. He's pardoning people before they're even sentenced or while they're fighting their sentencing. This example that we wrote about where this guy got a pardon just 12 days after his mother attended a $1 million a head fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago. He had been sentenced between the fundraiser and the pardon, but he had yet to go to jail, and his lawyers were pushing off his report date, as well as his payment of $4.4 million in restitution for having essentially cheated on his taxes. And he got the pardon, and that was all wiped away. And so we see a lot of these cases, if you add up the total of the restitution that these people who are getting pardons are being freed from the burden of paying, it's in the hundreds of millions, maybe over $1 billion at this point. And again, this is money that like Elon Musk is trying to save the government money. Well, this is money that like is owed to the government, or in some cases owed to victims. And the Trump administration is completely closing the book on it without collecting that money.
Yeah, I thought Ken made an important point a second ago, which is, it's easy to think, oh, is any of this new? This is not new. There's always been money in politics. But as Ken pointed out, there has never been a pardon process like this that we're seeing right now, in which you have a president essentially constantly pardoning people who are political supporters of him in the most brazen way. I just give an example. There was a guy named Trevor Milton, for instance, who was convicted of defrauding investors in an electric car company. He had distributed a promotional video in which the car appeared to be speeding along. It was, in fact, rolling downhill. And Trevor Milton and his wife donated $1.8 million to Trump's campaign and as a lawyer, they hired the brother of Attorney General Pam Bondi, Donald Trump's chief law enforcement officer. And lo and behold, Trevor Milton got a pardon, which not only will spare him having a felony on his record, it will also relieve him, perhaps, of an estimated $680 million in restitution payments. So if you think this isn't partly about money, $680 million. So there is a way in which Donald Trump has, in new ways, collapsed the boundaries between his personal politics, his business interests, and the interests of the country.
But the trouble is, I mean, it underlines even more the absolute disaster of Joe Biden pardoning his own family and his own son, because there is no high ground anymore for the Democrats to criticize Trump, for any of this behavior.
I do think there were Democrats at the time who worried about the precedent that would set and would say, well, this is going to make it easy for Donald Trump to do it. I think that we'll leave it to the public to decide if they think that these are equivalent and equal. I think you're going to see many more of this kind of essentially transactional pardon commerce over the course of the next 3 years, because after all, we're only 4 or 5 months into this.
Let's then move on to the question of crypto, which Ken also mentioned, because again, it's a first. We have a president who is involved in his own cryptocurrency, whose family are getting rich from it, whose employees or members of his administration, Steve Witkoff, his son, is involved in crypto as well, and this is all kind of swirling around. The administration's moves, that there are meetings going on around crypto that, follow the president's travel schedules as well. I mean, how is that even legal?
Well, in a way, he's exploiting the fact that this hasn't been thoroughly tested in the courts yet. Now, there is, the White House makes a performance of saying that there's no conflict of interest here because it's the president's son, Don Jr., and Eric Trump, who are involved directly in a lot of these transactions. But let's be blunt here. I mean, we are talking about something that we've never seen in this country, where you have the family's crypto venture auctioning off dinner with the president for 220 of the highest bidders. And by the way, they make money. The family and their partners make money on the buying and selling of these tokens. Even if the tokens eventually go to zero, they have made, by some estimates, hundreds of millions of dollars already in the first few months of this administration. And then on top of it, they are sitting on a stash of their own crypto coins, which would now be worth in the billions. So I think you're going to see that this is going to be an area where Democrats who are motivated on this issue will be drawing attention to it, and you may well see it in the courts.
Ken?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things about the crypto ventures. They are really remarkable, and I can't think of any precedent for them. Number one is to this point that Evan made about the White House sort of justification of this, saying it's the sons and not Trump, and also another justification they say is like this is his personal. This is the family's like personal finances separate from the presidency. Well, at this dinner that you mentioned, where they had the top 220 holders of this Trump meme coin, and Trump spoke at this dinner, they had the presidential seal on the podium when he was speaking. So, clearly that's not the message that they're sending the people who are investing in this. And they gave some of them tours of the White House, the top 20, I think, holders of the meme coins. I'm going to read one quote that Donald Trump Jr. Gave at I believe, a crypto conference, the government-sponsored business forum in Qatar last week. And he says, we tried during the first administration to be, to abide by the rules and the norms and he felt like they didn't get credit. So he said, even the deals that were totally legit, it didn't stop the insanity. I assume he's referring to protest there. So this time around, we said, hey, we're going to play by the rules, but we're not going to go so far as to stymie our business forever. They're going to hit you no matter what. So we're just going to play the game. So he's sort of admitting like, yeah, we went through, we sort of paid lip service to the norms last time. And this time we're just not even going to do it.
I mean, it was really interesting, Evan, as well, that the thing that the public and the commentators and even Trump supporters seemed to find really distasteful was the plane. You know, they did, because that was something that they could get their heads around. There was this big, giant plane on the tarmac, and they didn't like the idea of that being something that was essentially for Donald Trump after he becomes president. But this whole question of crypto investment and the money that they're getting from the Middle East into that, and what's really why is the Middle East putting so much money into this crypto venture that is closely aligned to the Trump family? No one's really asking.
Yeah, the plane is a classic example of what happens periodically in politics, which is that you get a moment that is just so inescapably vivid, so clear that even the most casual watcher of politics, somebody who tries to tune it out, who says, I don't want anything to do with this topic, who sees it just on the, on a screen in the corner of their office or in an airport or something, gets the feeling that this is not normal. And I think one of the things we've been talking about, so that's so important on this show, is the idea that, when is the public mood going to move? When is the public going to recognize this? Each one of these things is like a pebble on the pile of public awareness. And it takes a long time historically. I mean, there is actually a very direct analogy to the United States in the 19th century, that it took a long time between the moment when Mark Twain gave us the name The Gilded Age in 1873. It took, at that point, 17 years before the United States could even pass the first law against trusts, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. And even then, it was not a permanent change because there was this long struggle over the years to, robber barons, as they were called at the time, would try to pry open again their access to unlimited power. And then there would be efforts by civil society and others in government to try to bring it back into some more sustainable balance. That is the takeaway, is that it is a long process. And what builds that process, frankly, is things like public pressure and investigative reporting and a process of demonstrating and revealing the fact that there are things going on that the public does care about. I mean, the plane was an own goal by this administration because it took what has often been done in nods and winks and made it unbelievably, almost inescapably brazen.
And do you feel, when you say it's about investigative reporting, I mean, to both of you, I mean, Ken, there's clearly an attempt to sort of delegitimize the media. They're very open about it. They call you the fake news media. They're building their own clubs to try and exclude journalists from them, so that only the super rich can sort of hang out in bars and restaurants and country clubs, and you won't get access to them. I mean, do you think journalism can still uncover and operate with this administration in the same way as it could before? Or is it much harder?
Yeah, well, I actually think it's in some ways it's easier because it is just so blatant and it's so out there. And also maybe a little bit less so than in the first term, but there's certainly still like a high degree of factionalism in Trump world. So there are motivated sources and leakers who want to, tell you something because they think it's going to make a rival look bad. And so you have some of that, but like the ability to report a story that moves the needle, and captures the public attention and generates this, this public will that can generate the political will for change or restrictions or election results or move the needle in election results, I think is diminished. And I think part of that is an intentional effort by the Trump folks, not just the White House, but the allies, on the outside, to, change the subject and to be so chaotic and to be throwing so much out there that they are able to sort of shift attention away from the outrage of the moment that seems to be like a bad story to them, for them, to another outrage that maybe is a better story for them. And they're pretty savvy at it. It's not just like the chaos theory. I think it is sort of a thoughtful thing, and maybe it's instinctive with Trump and his understanding of the media coming up in the sort of go, tabloid 80s in New York. He is pretty effective at like shifting the focus to, chaotic stories that are more to his sort of political benefit.
Yeah, Evan, when the MAGA crowd, they'd look at this program and go, well, there's a guy from the New York Times, there's a guy from the New Yorker, these are sort of, liberals from the fake news media who don't even live in the real America. Are you being delegitimized?
Well, there's certainly an effort to do so. And I think that this is a part of the strategy, is to make people doubt that any kind of fact, no matter how vivid and obvious it is, like a plane being given by a foreign country in which you're seeking an enormous personal business deal, that is somehow not, that you're, as they say, that your eyes are deceiving you. But I will tell you, I think that there is something that runs beneath this. This is, in fact, part of what got Donald Trump elected to politics, was that he figured that out. He picked the lock on that. And he said, I can figure out a way to make people feel as if my money gives me special knowledge of the inside game, and I will then use that to drain the swamp, to use the immortal phrase. There were a lot of people who voted for him on that basis. And the more that this comes up, the more that these kinds of examples show this, obvious favor trading among friends, among allies, creating literally clubs. You mentioned before, but it's worth making explicit, a club with an initiation fee of up to $500,000, invite only, for people who are invited by Donald Trump Jr. and people around him. That does begin to bother conservatives who didn't vote for that. They voted for, in fact, the draining of the swamp. So, I think that the Elon Musk's ejection from politics, even though in the long run it will pay dividends for him, is a sign that on some level it did cross a threshold with the American public. And I think it's worth keeping in mind, this is an important point, is Americans are very ambivalent about big money. This is like a core fact. If you look at polls about us, what you find is that 60% of Americans believe that billionaires are making the country more unfair, and 60%, identical share, want to become billionaires themselves. That is like the essential American condition, this deep ambivalence, a cynicism and aspiration. And Donald Trump is gambling with that and betting that he can come out on the right side of it, but it is a gamble.
Let's just end on the courts then, because that's where this always ends up. It's years before the voters get their say, and Congress doesn't seem to be doing anything. So it does end up in the courts. And today we've seen the courts with this major intervention into a huge part of Trump policy, which is tariffs. And it's thrown, the global economic system into chaos, because nobody really knows what it means for, for trade negotiations, for existing deals. Britain's done a deal. What does that deal mean now? There is genuine confusion, and it makes America look even more unstable and unpredictable than it did before. But can the courts withstand the pressure that the administration, puts on them when they talk about the courts as a coup?
It is clearly moving in the direction where the courts are the bulwark against some of the largest, most questionable abuses of the law. And I think, interestingly, it's friends in the legal profession, when you talk to legal scholars, who say, look, you can't count on the courts ultimately. The courts don't have an army. They don't have a police force. They have limited powers to be able to enforce their own rulings. They have the U.S. Marshals, which can hold people, and they can hold people in contempt. But ultimately, if a president chooses to defy court orders, it gets to be the essence of a constitutional crisis. But in the meantime, the courts have proven over and over again, and you see this in the data, that over the course of the last 4 or 5 months, over and over, they have stepped in to impede, disrupt, or delay some of the Trump administration's most aggressive tactics, and it has, in fact, had an impact. And so I think you should expect to see a growing confrontation between these two branches of government.
Ken?
It is the ultimate question whether the Trump administration will continue to abide by the court rulings. We have seen like a few examples where they seem to be, sort of testing the boundaries. The questions about whether the deportees were in flight before the court ordered them not to be deported, and there's sort of some gamesmanship around there. But like surprisingly, Trump has seemed to defer to the courts in some ways, but it's one of the reasons why. And by the way, I think this is a bigger issue than just Trump. I think like a lot of politics is moving into the courts, and there's so much litigation around the voting rules and the campaign finance rules, and the recounts and the vote counting after the fact, that this is really becoming like an increasing forum for our politics. And it's one of the reasons why, in some ways, like I think like Trump gets too much credit. He came in this Project 2025, laid out all these initiatives that he's taken, and has gotten some pushback from the courts. But they were not the plans were not so sophisticated as to prevent that court scrutiny and prevent the court from like coming down on them. Now, the one thing I'll say and I don't know whether this was a part of Project 2025 or just part of Trump's like grievance and retribution tour, but it's why his fights with these big law firms are so significant in his effort to like cow them and get them to back down, with like all of his agenda being sort of litigated in the courts, and so much of politics,
which again he's lost in the courts.
Yeah, but if you don't have lawyers who are willing to stand up to you, like good lawyers at big firms, like that's going to be potentially a major advantage. And so that is something that I think people like. I think some of the hand wringing about authoritarian impulse is a little overwrought, but that's one place where I do think that the concern is appropriate, because that is a major check. The legal system is the major check on his impulses. And if he is sort of working the refs or working the litigants, the people who might be on the other side of these cases, and potentially scaring them away preemptively, well, that would potentially have a major impact here.
It's quite difficult, Evan, though, to work out where this all ends up, though, isn't it? Because on the one hand, a confrontation with the courts, you might expect it to play for Trump politically. He can say, I'm elected, the courts aren't, they're trying to frustrate the will of the people. On the other hand, if they keep stopping him from doing things for which he hasn't, made the work to get it through Congress, and it turns out that he can't just do whatever he wants on immigration, and he can't do whatever he wants with Harvard University, and he can't do whatever he wants with tariffs, and he can't actually do that much, it turns out, to transform American lives. The question is, how will the American people judge him?
Well, he has the advantage of the first mover. I mean, this is the nature of relying on the courts as a bulwark, is that it is, when the president does something, it's a fait accompli, and then it takes the courts time, and it's slow to roll things back. So at times they can put a stay in, or they can delay something. But it is very, very disruptive in the meantime. Just look at the volatility in global markets. Look at what the impact has been for people who on their retirement savings. And I think, look, fundamentally, Americans, and let's remind ourselves, we're talking partly about elite Americans here, because for the Trump project to succeed, he needs to maintain the support of the business community, of people in this country who fund his campaigns and will ultimately fund the successors to his politics in the future of MAGA America. And they have benefited over the years from the rule of law in this country. I can name all of the reasons why that is an imperfect description, but fundamentally, this is a country where if you have a contract, it can be protected and defended in a court of law. If he undermines the validity of the rule of law by challenging and defying the courts, he is moving the United States fundamentally from a phase that has defined its history into a completely different phase. And, scholars will say that we have traditionally been a civil oligarchy in this country, meaning that powerful figures respected fundamentally the rule of law. If you lose that, you move into what's known as a sultanistic oligarchy, which is exactly what it sounds like. And that's a country in which the rule of law is less powerful than the personalistic power of the leader. And the question for, I think, America's business elites is that a world that you really want to live in?
If I could take a shot at your question. So like, what will the legacy be if the courts sort of check him on the policy stuff? And I think it's cultural. There is like a cultural shift that he is attempting to effectuate. And I think there's some evidence that he has successfully effectuated, where it's like he is moving some of these elite institutions off of some of their principles and moving parts of the business community and parts of this sort of oligarchy. Evan mentioned the tech titans who sat behind him at his inauguration. Well, tech was like a sort of, it wasn't just coded left. It was like a major financial engine behind the Democratic Party. And now it's not. And like, I don't want to give Trump too much credit, but it seems like there are already sort of libertarian instincts in Silicon Valley and among some of these, tech bros, so to speak. And Trump really tapped into that. And also some of the sort of cultural, some of the backlash to the woke, the woke dictates that people felt were sort of shaping culture. And so not only did he like tap into that to get elected, but he also harnessed the money of some of these extremely wealthy folks, not necessarily just in funding his projects and his political groups, but also in cutting off the funding that they were steering to the left. So I think that could have a long-term impact. I mean, we'll see what happens. Certainly when he leaves, I think there will be like a battle for the soul of the Republican Party, and there will be a real push by some of the billionaires and operatives who are more traditional, country club conservatives who are in favor of free trade and in favor of immigration, and the neocons who are in favor of interventionism that the likes of which Trump says that he is opposed. But I think that Trump has already sort of made an impact by showing that like the right broadly, Republicans can tap into some of these channels and sources of funds and dynamics that were previously seen as off limits and were previously seen as like the property of the left.
We'll leave it there. Ken Vogel, Evan Osnos, thank you both very much indeed. That's the forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.